I've been the night watchman at this museum for 10 years. Last night, I finally realized why the statues are always in different spots by 4 a.m. They aren't haunted, they're hunting. The Blackwood Institute of Antiquities is a place where time is supposed to stand still. When the heavy oak doors click shut at 5 p.m. and the last of the tourists depart, the air changes. It grows heavy, thick with the dust of pulverized centuries and the metallic tang of old bronze. My name is Elias Thorne, and for a decade, my life has been measured in the sweep of a flashlight beam across cold, unblinking eyes. People often ask me if I get scared being alone with the dead. I used to tell them that the living are far more dangerous. I was wrong. My shift begins in the security hub, a cramped room filled with flickering monitors that offer a grainy, stuttering view of the galleries. There are 32 cameras in total, yet they seem to miss more than they capture. On my first year, I noticed the discrepancies. A Roman bust in the West Wing would be facing the door at midnight, but by the time I did my 3 a.m. rounds, its chin would be tilted toward the ceiling. I blamed the vibrations of the nearby subway. I blamed the settling of the foundation. I even blamed my own tired eyes, convinced that the shadows played tricks on a mind deprived of sleep. But as the years bled into one another, the movements became more pronounced. It started with the Mourning Woman, a life-sized marble statue from the Hellenistic period. She sits in the center of the classical gallery, her face buried in her hands. One Tuesday, I noticed her fingers had shifted. They were no longer pressed against her marble cheeks. They were spread slightly as if she were peeking through them. I stood there for 20 minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, waiting for a twitch, a breath, a sign of life. There was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the museum and the smell of ozone from the air filtration system. The silence of a museum is not truly silent. It is a layering of echoes. You hear the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the climate control, and occasionally a sound that doesn't belong, a soft, dry scrape, like sandpaper being dragged over velvet. That is the sound of stone moving on stone. I heard it tonight as I walked past the Hall of Totems. I stopped dead, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The sound had come from behind me. I turned the beam toward the obsidian sentinel, a 7-foot-tall figure carved from volcanic glass. It stood exactly where it should have been, but the floor around its base was covered in a fine black grit that hadn't been there an hour ago. The grit was a trail. A predator doesn't always run. Sometimes it merely waits for you to turn your back. I felt a cold sweat prickle my hairline. I've always treated these artifacts with respect, but tonight the atmosphere felt predatory. The shadows cast by the Egyptian sarcophagi seemed to stretch toward my boots, reaching out like dark, elongated fingers. I realized then that the museum wasn't a storehouse of history. It was a cage, and the locks were only designed to keep people out, not to keep the inhabitants in. As I retreated toward the security office, I passed the Gallery of Myths. In the center stands a bronze depiction of a Spartan hoplite, his spear leveled at an invisible foe. I remembered distinctly that the spear point was aimed at the far wall when I started my shift. Now, as the beam of my light hit the bronze, I saw the spearhead was angled directly at my chest. The metal didn't glint, it seemed to swallow the light. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a heavy stone eyelid clicking open. It was a dry, stony sound that resonated in the marrow of my bones. I didn't look back. I ran for the security hub and locked the door, but as I looked at the monitors, I realized the cameras were going dark, one by one, as if something were walking past them and snuffing out the lenses with a cold, invisible hand. The security hub felt like a sinking ship. I sat there, staring at the black monitors, my breath hitching in the dark. To calm my nerves, I pulled out the incident logs, a collection of dusty ledgers dating back to the museum's founding in 1902. I had read snippets before, but tonight I needed to know if I was truly losing my mind. I bypassed the standard reports of broken glass or faulty wiring and went straight for the unclassified anomalies section. The first entry that caught my eye was from 1924, written by a man named Julian Vance. He had been the head curator during the acquisition of the Sumerian Mourners, a set of 5 clay figures found in a tomb that was never meant to be opened. Vance wrote about a janitor who had been found dead in the basement, his body unmarked but his face frozen in a mask of absolute terror. The official cause of death was heart failure, but Vance's private notes told a different story. He claimed the clay figures were found surrounding the body in a perfect circle, their small, painted mouths smeared with a dark organic residue that hadn't been there when they were created in Iraq. Vance's handwriting grew more erratic as the pages turned. He spoke of the Great Migration. He believed that these artifacts were not merely stone and clay, but vessels for a residual consciousness. a hunger that survived the death of the civilizations that birthed them. "They do not move when observed," he wrote, "for the gaze of the living acts as a tether, pinning them to the realm of the inanimate. But in the dark, when no eye is upon them, the tether snaps. They seek the warmth they once possessed. They seek the blood that once gave them purpose." I flipped the page and found a photograph clipped to the ledger. It was a grainy black and white shot of the medieval hall. In the background, a suit of armor stood on a pedestal. In the next photo, taken minutes later, the armor was 5 feet to the left, its metal gauntlet raised as if reaching for the camera. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't a new phenomenon. The Blackwood Institute had been a feeding ground for over a century. The restless spirits, the public whispered about, weren't ghosts. They were the objects themselves, animated by a primal lithic instinct. I looked up at my own monitors. One of them flickered back to life. It showed the Egyptian wing. The great diorite statue of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war, was missing from her plinth. The heavy stone base sat empty, showing deep gouges where claws had gripped the rock. I felt a surge of nausea. Sekhmet was known as the Lady of Terror. In the myths, she was a goddess who nearly wiped out humanity because her bloodlust could not be sated. And now she was loose in the halls. I remembered an old theory mentioned in a fringe archaeology journal I'd found in the museum library. It suggested that certain materials, diorite, basalt, obsidian, were capable of holding quantum imprints of the rituals performed around them. If a statue was used in 1,000 sacrifices, it became more than a statue. It became a battery for violence. I realized with a jolt that the museum wasn't just a collection of art. It was a pantry. We had spent decades gathering the most violent, blood-soaked relics of the past and putting them all in one building. We had built a concentrated hive of ancient predators, and I was the only thing on the menu tonight. I reached for the radio to call for backup, but all that came through the speaker was a low, rhythmic grinding sound, like teeth being sharpened against a whetstone. By 1 a.m., the psychological weight of the museum began to take its toll. Every shadow seemed to have mass. Every silence felt like a held breath. I decided I couldn't stay in the security hub. If Sekhmet or the Spartan were moving, the hub was a trap with only one exit. I grabbed my heavy ring of keys, my high-intensity flashlight, and a crowbar from the maintenance closet. I needed to reach the telecommunications room in the basement to land a hardline call to the outside world. As I stepped back into the corridor, the air felt 10 degrees colder. The smell of the museum had changed. The dusty scent was gone, replaced by something raw and metallic, the smell of wet earth and old copper. I kept my light low, scanning the floor. I didn't want to look at the pedestals. I didn't want to see what else was missing. But I couldn't help it. As I passed the oceanic exhibit, I noticed the Haida totem was leaning at an impossible angle. It wasn't falling, it was bowing. Its carved wooden eyes seemed to follow the arc of my light, the pupils appearing to dilate in the artificial glow. I reached the grand staircase, the marble steps echoing under my boots. I felt a sudden, sharp tug on my jacket. I spun around, swinging the crowbar, but there was nothing there. Just a row of Roman busts lining the banister. I shone my light on them. They were all smiling. I had cleaned those busts for years. They were supposed to be stoic, frozen in expressions of senatorial dignity. Now their marble lips were curled back, revealing rows of blunt, stone teeth. They weren't attacking yet, they were mocking me. I scrambled down the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I reached the basement level, a place of exposed pipes and yellowed brick. This was where the modern mysteries lived, the items too strange or dangerous for public display. I passed a crate labeled the Dybbuk's Mirror, and for a split second, I saw a reflection of myself in the glass that wasn't me. It was a version of Elias Thorne with no eyes, just hollow pits filled with shifting sand. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The basement was a labyrinth of storage units. I found the door to the telecom room, but it was jammed. Something heavy was leaning against it from the other side. I threw my shoulder into the wood, screaming with effort. The door budged an inch, and I caught a glimpse of what was inside. It wasn't furniture. It was a collection of African ceremonial masks, hundreds of them, piled against the door. They weren't just wood and straw. They were vibrating, a low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. I realized then that they weren't trying to keep me out. They were trying to keep me in the hallway. I backed away, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The artifacts were coordinating. They weren't individual hunters. They were a pack. The movement I had seen over the last 10 years wasn't random. It was a long-term tactical repositioning. They had been learning my routes, my habits, my weaknesses. They had waited until they were all in place. I heard a heavy thud from the floor above. Then another. It was the sound of something incredibly heavy descending the stairs. Thump, scrape, thump, scrape. Sekhmet was coming. The goddess of war didn't need to hurry. She knew the basement was a dead end. I retreated further into the storage depths, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark like a dying star. I found myself in the cold storage vault, where the most delicate organic remains were kept. Sarcophagi, bog bodies, and feathered cloaks from the Inca Empire lined the shelves. I hid behind a stack of crates containing Viking funerary goods, clicking off my light. I needed to think. The residual energy theory was too simple. This wasn't just energy, it was an intelligence. I thought about the materials, the stone, the wood, the bone. These were all things that came from the earth. Perhaps the artifacts weren't possessed by spirits at all. Perhaps the earth itself has a memory, and when we carve it into the shapes of our gods and monsters, we give that memory a body. By bringing these objects together, we had created a localized concentration of the earth's oldest, most vengeful thoughts. They hated us for pulling them from the ground. They hated us for staring at them through glass cases. The air in the vault began to vibrate. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a deep tectonic resonance that rattled my ribcage. From the darkness, a voice whispered. It didn't use words, but I understood it. It was a sound like shifting tectonic plates, a grinding tectonic groan that translated in my mind as, "You are the guest who stayed too long." I turned on my light for a brief second and saw the bog body, a perfectly preserved man from 2,000 years ago, sitting upright on his gurney. His leathery skin was pulled tight over his skull, and his black, sightless eyes were fixed on me. He wasn't moving aggressively, he was simply watching. He was the witness for the execution. I heard the door to the vault groan. The heavy steel was being dented from the outside. Something with immense strength was pulling the door off its hinges. I saw the tip of a bronze spear, the Spartan spear, pierce through the metal like it was paper. The bronze didn't look like metal anymore. It looked like it was pulsing with a dark, inner heat. A spike of pure terror lanced through me as the spearhead began to bleed, a thick, black ichor dripping onto the concrete floor. I realized that the ancient forces didn't care about my logic or my skepticism. They didn't care about the laws of physics. They were the laws of a world that existed before man ever learned to write. I looked around for a weapon, but what do you use against a god made of stone? I grabbed a canister of pressurized CO2 from a fire suppression system. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The door gave way with a deafening roar of twisting metal. There stood the bronze Spartan, his face a featureless mask of war, and beside him, the lion-headed Sekhmet. Her diorite eyes glowed with a faint, predatory amber light. They didn't breathe, but the air around them shimmered with heat. They were no longer artifacts. They were the hunt personified. The final hour before dawn is always the darkest. I stood in the center of the vault, the CO2 canister held like a holy relic. The Spartan stepped forward, his bronze sandals clanging against the floor. Every step cracked the concrete. Sekhmet circled to my left, her movements fluid and feline, despite being made of 2 tons of solid rock. They were flanking me. The hunting instinct was perfect. Why? I screamed into the dark. My voice sounded thin and pathetic. What do you want? The Spartan paused. He raised his spear, and for a moment the museum was silent. Then the sound came again, the grinding of stone. It wasn't a voice. It was a reflection of every scream ever uttered in his presence on 1,000 ancient battlefields. He didn't want anything. He simply was. He was the act of the kill, frozen in time and now thawed by the darkness. I didn't wait for him to strike. I cracked the valve on the CO2 canister, sending a high-pressure blast of freezing gas directly at Sekhmet's face. The sudden thermal shock hit the diorite. Stone, especially ancient stone, does not handle rapid temperature changes well. I heard a sharp, crystalline crack. A fissure appeared across the goddess's snout. She didn't scream, but she recoiled, her predatory grace momentarily shattered. I bolted. I ran past the Spartan, feeling the wind of his spear as it whistled inches from my ear. I scrambled up the service ladder, climbing toward the roof access. I could hear them below me, the heavy rhythmic thudding of a dozen statues joining the chase. The mourning woman, the obsidian sentinel, the Sumerian mourners, they were all coming. The museum was a vertical hive of moving history, all of it rising to meet me. I burst onto the roof just as the first rays of dawn began to gray the horizon. I collapsed onto the gravel, my lungs burning. I looked back at the heavy metal hatch. It was shaking. Something was hammering on it from below. Boom, boom, boom. But as the sun's edge finally broke over the city skyline, the hammering stopped. I lay there until 8 a.m. when the morning shift arrived. When I finally descended with the police and the museum director, the scene was normal. Sekhmet was back on her plinth, though the director was horrified to find a large crack running across her face, which he attributed to a vandalism incident. The Spartan was in the gallery of myths, his spear aimed at the wall. The Roman busts were stoic. The grit was gone. The director fired me on the spot, of course. He didn't believe a word of my story about the moving statues or the hunting goddess. He saw a man who had suffered a nervous breakdown and damaged priceless artifacts. I didn't argue. I just wanted out. But as I walked out of those heavy oak doors for the last time, I stopped. I looked back at the mourning woman in the center of the hall. She was back in her original position, her face in her hands. But as the sunlight hit the marble, I saw something that hadn't been there before. On the floor, just beneath her feet, was a small, discarded object. It was my flashlight. I had dropped it in the basement 3 floors down. Now I sit in my apartment and look at the news. I see reports of museums all over the world. The Louvre, the British Museum, the Met, reporting unexplained structural settling and minor vandalism. I know the truth. They aren't settling. They are stretching. They are practicing. What do you think is happening in these museums? Is it a trick of the light, a shared delusion of lonely men in the dark? Or is the history we've collected finally tired of being watched? Last night, I realized the statues moved by 4 a.m. because that is when the night is deepest and the tether is thinnest. They aren't haunting the halls. They are waiting for the day the doors don't open at 9 a.m. And when that day comes, the world will realize that we didn't inherit the earth, we just borrowed it from the things that were here first. The question isn't whether the artifacts move. The question is, who will be left to watch them when they finally decide to leave the building?